But we can begin a kind of a conversation. We can have the starts of a conversation now, mediated by microphones. So, hands?
I just wonder, it's a real short question. Do you think that the people that just trying to find a way to connect the two talks, because I think they're really dealing with such different constituencies. But you, in your talk, you emphasized the kind of mindsets of the people that you were studying in the lab as principled and, well-intentioned in terms of transformations. And I'm just wondering, do you think the kinds of issues that Lisa mentioned in her talk are at all registering within the minds and sensibilities and practices of people that you're kind of studying and observing?
Yes and no. I mean, of course they are there. And in the minds of those people, maybe an anecdote, just a quick anecdote. So in this whole lab, one of the things is always to leave that which is that which is taken for granted, and have a great idea that explodes that which is taken for granted. And one young researcher, a guy of color, said, well, once you are on this other plane where you are in an idea, where you are outside of the plane of the granted, you are in a new space and you take something else for granted and you cannot see something else. And he said that which you cannot be able to see once you're in this new space is capitalism. So they do reflect on that, but that's kind of like also where it stops. They know that this stops, but they cannot afford to then think further, because I think they would endanger their way of working. They know that it is there, but they can't go there.
So I wanted to ask to some of your points, Lisa, about sort of labor in these sort of contingent gaming spaces. Do you see the distribution of sort of, support and sort of emotional support and, actual sort of material support that has been sort of deployed in response to Gamergate and to the sort of hatred that people have been on the receiving end of? Do you see that also sort of reflecting similar sort of disparities in terms of women who have been subject to these attacks? Because I've been watching as a lot of trans women and women of color who are involved in this, in the making of the scene versus, necessarily being only personalities who kind of are more involved in commentary, like Anita Sarkeesian. A lot of them are announcing that they're retiring, whatever that means in general.
Yeah, I think that's partly what Gamergate did, is that it made defending yourself from being doxxed, harassed, threatened online a full-time job, such that people could not deny that it was impinging on their ability to actually earn a living, or in some ways getting them fired from their jobs, like Adria Richards. So by calling out some sexist commentary at PyCon, which is a Python conference, Python developer conference, she lost her job. And so I think there's a lot of attention paid to the two guys she called out. Like, they lost their jobs, but quickly got new ones, and she still hasn't gotten a new job. And she's also a Python developer. So I think that's often the backstory to these stories about, call-out culture is so awful. Like, they don't really follow through to see what the end of it is. But absolutely, I think this last year has kind of proven that being a woman of color in gaming is just hard work. Like, in a kind of literal, time-based way, it's hard work, and it's also often really awful work that people don't want to do, but that they do it because they want to preserve the space for other people to be there. So that's the Audre Lorde thing, too. Like, for her, that is absolutely what women of color feminism is about. It's not about you, right? It's about the collectivity, and the collectivity is broad. So I have some quotes from the Combahee River Collective about why we have to take care of women of color. And it's that you do it for selfish reasons. It's not because you care about them. You do it because if you do it, then you have taken care of everybody else. Because they are the group which is the most systematically shut off from resources of all kinds. So it's just the most efficient way. Like a hacker would love that, right? Just pick the most efficient way, and that's what will work. So I think that's where this is coming from as well. I mean, I can't not see this real interest in this bridge called my back again as having something to do with saying, okay, these were survival politics, and we needed them once, and we kind of need them now, right? And depressingly, for different reasons, but similar results, which is differences in access to life, right? Just in a basic way. So.
Let's go to the other side of the room for once. I'll get to you, okay? 1, 2, 3, okay? So, hey, Andrew?
Thank you both for your talks. I'm afraid this question is a little more for Gertz, but I think Lisa could probably weigh in some respects as well. I was really struck by this notion of this kind of communication design group as sort of going into South of Market and kind of trying to bring this park, kind of Xerox PARC 70s culture, like back to a tech community that seems to have lost it, which is really strange, you know. But I kind of agree with it in some way. I worked in South of Market in a tech company in the 90s, and the people that I know from that time don't really recognize Silicon Valley and the tech companies as they exist today. And I think that's often overlooked in the way that people talk about Silicon Valley today as kind of this monolith that's always been since, you know, the 60s, a certain kind of way. You know, there are changes within the way that the technology industry in Silicon Valley specifically has worked. But I also wonder if this inability to see capitalism that you described is actually kind of, you know, an ultimate, like an ultimate problem here, because it seems to me that to attempt to do that is almost an embodiment of this like post-structuralist notion that's been floating around of the idea that if you do something again, the results will be different eventually, you know? So, you know, there's simultaneously a break, I think, between this kind of Xerox PARC style, like university research center modeled notion of play in tech and, say, contemporary tech, you know, it's contemporary web 2.0, app economy, Silicon Valley companies. But one also seems to, the latter seems to kind of like lead from the former. And I thought it was really interesting that you talked about HyperCard in the world. So, I mean, there's a way in which these companies are going back to the exact moment when the computer became a multimedia device, a device for remediation in the mid to late 80s. And it's like almost like they're trying to have a do-over of the last like 20 years of tech culture, and I wonder if that's possible, if there's a, you know, a different result at the end of doing that, or if it, you know, if we're just gonna, it's just gonna repeat itself in some way, even if it's successful. So I don't know if either of you have thoughts on that, but I'd love to hear them.
I think what we'll do is take the other two questions in order, one here and then one here, and then let our panelists respond. Okay? So could we have?
Yeah, just really quickly, if you could clarify exactly what is the relationship between deep work to the process of bootstrapping? Because I feel like you got cut off before we could really understand that. Please.
Okay. And then could you bring the mic? Oh, okay. Somebody gonna get the mic. Could you bring the mic over here, please?
Okay, yeah. So, I really like how you two your talks kind of reflect on each other or just like provoke each other. So when I'm looking at the CDG, I have kind of a half of my brain at least like engineering, and this is the best kind of conditions you can imagine. And usually if I want to kind of justify that, I say this is the luxury we should have in communism. But then you remind us, I mean, this is the work which would be great to do when whatever utopia is kind of, yeah, close. So what I would like to hear is like, what do you think, what people from the lab, how they would kind of see your talk, and how they would then relate to labor, work conditions, exclusion. Do they think of who's there, you know, like whenever we do conferences, like how many women, how many people have got, you know, things like that. And that lab, I don't know, maybe they do that, but I wouldn't say that it kind of really goes that way. And at the same time, from your perspective, if it's even possible to kind of analyze and see to justify how that kind of vision, how that kind of a fantasy, how can be justified in a world with so many unjust. And of course, I don't expect any moralization. It's kind of like a structural and what we heard from you. Yeah.
Okay, so now we need detailed answers to these questions. You each have 2.5 minutes. About. Okay. Who would like to go first?
I'll go first.
Okay.
I think that's, you pointed out why these talks really go together well, I think, because it is like the front and the back end of work, right, of labor. And I think what we can see is that these are all here and they all have a place. Some of them are just deprivileged. They're not invisible. Like when we look, we can see them. They're just not seen as valuable. So the taxonomic labor of saying whose work is valuable and whose is not is really evident. So I don't think that lavishly funded skunk works where you can be object-oriented in every way, including politically, and modular and compartmentalized, which Wendy has written about, are bad for innovation, whatever that is. But I think that more fragile networks, which are things that, like independent presses, or things like websites which don't work very well, or things that are, a little more contingent, but more controlled and less exploitative of their users, may be the price to pay. So like the idea of robustness, we all love that. And I think the things you showed were somewhat robust, right? But that's what happens. I mean, that's the collective touch when it comes to technologies, is that they break a little. And so the part I didn't read as well was Lisa Parks' part of the broken world, right? Social media is a broken world. It's full of racism, absolutely everywhere. And people are trying to fix it, and they are being broken, right? So I'm interested in the breaking of people as part of the fixing of the world and the continual breakage that we don't acknowledge, and how the kind of quest for stable networks is the continual breaking of those affordances in those people. Yeah.
Okay, the question about possible redo of Xerox PARC or other moments, whatever, like SRI and so on. No and yes, no, obviously, because we are totally different times, a totally different technological situation. Yes, in a very, very dangerous ways, because, I mean, this stuff created a lot of the evil technologies that we have now. So it's most likely that what is being created now will not be used for, in fact, creating, understanding, and interacting in totally new ways, but something else. I don't think that it's only going to be used by SAP for managers who run. It's going to do other things, but it's very hard to predict. So yes and no and maybe, something like that. Sorry, unsatisfying answer. But a big question, I mean, that's the long project, of course, like to find that out. Second question, deep work and bootstrapping, what has it to do? I mean, like, it has to do together that they tell me that it has something to do together. And it has to do together that bootstrapping runs through your body and it's a long-term project and changes yourself. But however, Engelbart mostly talks about the wonderful collective intelligence that is augmented, but it's also something very lonely, and that's the tension that they're playing out. And about, to Marcel, I presented something like that last week, like a few days ago, to the lab back, and they agreed with all the presentation, like most of the stories that are told about them, but the one thing made them really feel awkward, and that's the moment when I said, listen guys, I think what you have here is communism. And that just didn't, which surprised me in my European way. I thought that's the greatest comment that you can make. But it wasn't Igitt, but it was like one of these moments, awkward.
I'm so happy the word communism has come up in a session on labor. I think we should thank our guests.